is that not one person has stepped forward and said, I like this budget and here's why. A lot of times when things are done that we got to do, somebody says, they'll say, yeah, we got to tighten our belts, or we got to take the hit now so our kids don't. Nobody's saying that on this budget. It's just, no one likes this budget, at least in my listening sessions. So I just want to share some of their thoughts with you and some solid information from the Nonpartisan Fiscal Bureau. Let's start with healthcare. Such passionate testimony, I mean really passionate testimony. Governor Walker's budget guts senior care. That's the little piece that I pulled up from this budget. I've done it before, and I made sure people understood what this was, in hopes that the Republicans' hand comes out of the cookie jar and they leave this alone. And the governor wants to cut $15 million from the program, pushing people onto the much more expensive, much more complicated Medicare Part D program. Now, maybe you've heard me talk about this. I've taken up senior care as my personal project in this budget. My goal is to give people a way to express their support, so I launched a petition drive. Last week, my fellow Democrats and I turned in over 13,500 petitions in support of senior care as it is to Republican leaders. The response was overwhelming, and for good reason. More than 85,000 people in Wisconsin are enrolled in senior care. And the benefit from the program's simple enrollment process, $30 annual fee, $5 copays for generic drugs, $15 for brand names. That's it, period. Taxpayers doing this save $90 million per year through senior care's direct negotiation with drug companies. That last part I want to repeat. Direct negotiation. We're the only state out of all 50 that negotiates with the drug companies to get their lowest price. And that's why we save so much taxpayer money here. Okay, everyone else is on Medicare Part D. It was written by the drug companies. It was voted on by a lot of people who voted on it that became a lobbyist for the drug companies. And that's why it's a tough one to change around. But here in Wisconsin, we have. And we've done it bipartisanly. This was done by Tommy Thompson as he was in Washington as a Secretary of Health and Families, and Governor McCallum did this, and ever since we've kept this, and it's been strongly supported by both parties until these last few budgets. Governor Walker wants to change it. The latest development, my colleagues across the aisle are now talking of taking a stand for senior care. Boy, that sounds great. Who can fight with that? Oh, they're going to take a stand for it. They didn't agree with what the governor was doing. Even better. I don't either. But they kept talking. That's the problem. They're considering cutting off future enrollment and increasing annual costs for current enrollees. So if you got senior care, you can keep it. But if you're 64 and a half, you're out of luck. That's just another way of killing a program. That's the way I see it. You're just doing it differently. And shame on you. So that's one of their ideas. That's not what, and that comes to the education of this. So if you've got a representative that's nearby and she may say, oh, we're saving that. Explain, you say, well, then you're not touching it, right? You're leaving it as is, right? No changes whatsoever, right? See what answer you get. The answer is, oh, of course. Well, then high five. But if it's anything to, well, we got to do a little, or the senior care is not being saved under those conditions. So let me be crystal clear at this point. Saving senior care means leaving senior care alone. That's it, period. End of story, close the book. So the hits don't stop there. Family care. While the governor would expand family care statewide, but it wouldn't be family care as we know. Managed care organizations would be dissolved in favor of out-of-state corporate insurance companies. That's not family care anymore. When Kitty Rhodes, the Secretary of Health and Families, DHS, Department of Health and Family, she got to this and she goes, well, I didn't know this was going to be in there. I want to tell you, I mean, in so many words she said, well, I didn't know this was going to be in the budget. This is fascinating to me, and I'll tell you why. Because when you're a governor, you've got an idea or two how you want your budget to look. And then you bring in your secretaries, your first in line, your leaders that are in your administration. and you say, here's what I have, if you've got anything, I'm sure they ask for that too, or at least I would, but most governors say, and then here's my budget, which pertains to your department. In other words, your marching orders. This is what I want you to sell. But here we had someone who said, well, I didn't know this was going to be in here. That's incredible to me. It's incredible. And Kitty Rhodes, I've served with her. She was a co-chair of joint finance. She wasn't someone that we hired off the street or someone who had to learn a few things. She had her sea legs. And she said that this is basically a surprise to me. Wow. Think about that. That's how our governor leads. His own supporters, his own lieutenants, his own leaders in his administration, they're surprised too along with us. So, ADRCs, those insurance companies would also take the place of county-based aging and disability resource centers. IRIS, the I Respect, I Select, or IRIS program, which helps folks with long-term disabilities choose the kind of care that they need and want, would be simply and completely eliminated if the governor has his way. These changes have no positive fiscal impact. In other words, they're not really budget items, but they're here. And they're going to change the face of our state. They're going to change people's lives. And they're going to use, I'm going to use a word here that I should be using a lot. They're going to create immense uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how this is going to work. We're having hard times getting those answers as well. And that's frustrating. And for someone who's disabled, and it's working pretty well for them as is, now it's going to change and no one can answer as to what that change is going to look like after the governor does it. Wow. That's just a horrible piece of this budget. And the 50,000 people in these programs, they weren't consulted first again. Their family members weren't consulted. And the DHS secretary wasn't even consulted. Moving on, UW funding. This is Chuck's personal favorite. Well, maybe that's not really. But anyway.
He's a favorite.
Okay, all right. Well, the governor proposes a $300 million cut to the state's strongest economic engine. And Republicans weekly say they'll do what they can if revenue numbers are good later this month. If we got a little cash, we're going to try and give some to you. But they're saying this to quite a few people, not just the UW system. So, and the revenue numbers, that's a good question as to what they're going to look like, but that's what they're waiting for before they talk to you any further about this. In exchange for the cuts, the governor offered the UW ability to be an independent public authority, cutting ties to the state, but Republican leaders say they won't support that. But I always thought that was silly in the first place. You can do what you want, except for tuition. You got to freeze that. And you know, there's an old rule of thumb that I heard when I first took this job years ago, that, and it's true, that you as a legislature, any legislature, you're not beholden to anything the legislature did before you. So if the governor says you can do what you want, that promise can only really last, technically, only for 2 years. Beyond that, a new legislature, new faces in the Capitol, they can change these deals. And so think about that. I mean, this deal of do what you want, but except for tuition, you got to freeze that. And then 2 years come, well, we're going to freeze it again. Well, we weren't here when the governor made that deal. I was the governor then, but he shouldn't have done that. I mean, these are silly, silly deals. That's my perspective on the whole thing. That's something that's very rarely talked about. But they'll do what they can if there's a few more dollars in the jar. And so here's what the cuts will mean. Layoffs and buyouts for faculty, wait lists for certain high-demand classes, program cuts. Example, UW Oshkosh just recently said, soccer and tennis, gone. The bottom line is our kids won't get the same kind of quality education that we had access to, period. Governor's budget also fails to fully fund Wisconsin's GI Bill, a move that could leave veterans out in the lurch as they restart their lives and careers. Interesting one, but they got it too. The money, I guess, just isn't there. You know, it's funny too, because remember when Governor Walker first took over in 2011, his budget, A lot of the things that he was doing then, he would say over and over again, well, I don't want to do this, but we're broke. We're broke. He's not saying that this time, because now he still does it, but it gets a little silly as he still tries to blame everything on Jim Doyle. And let's remember, Jim Doyle, his budget, the last budget that he presented, was not the best. But let's remember, get your memories back to that time. That was during the worst recession since the Great Depression. What's Governor Walker's excuse this time? As other states like Minnesota have surpluses. Other states are turning that corner since the Great Recession. What's our excuse? And I'm almost afraid to ask, because I know it'll happen, but it's something to think about. So, and a lot of these things too, I hear a lot of students as they listen to their professors or see the angst on their professors' faces, and they think about how they're going to graduate someday. But I've talked to the chancellor, talked to professors. They're going to have classes, but they're not going to be offering them because they aren't going to have as many people teaching anymore. They're only going to be able to offer them for maybe every other semester, or they're going to space these out. It's going to take longer to get your degree because of these cuts. That's just one example. So K-12 education. See Wilson in the crowd, and he's on the school board in Milton, and I know this is near and dear to him. And so here we go. I've heard strong opposition, and I have, on these cuts. So the $150 cut per pupil in funding for our public schools. And that's how Wilson and other school board members, superintendents, they budget. And Whitewater especially just got a shot to the gut because they went through a referendum, assuming they weren't going to get any extra revenues. It was probably going to stay flat. So they ran a referendum through, they came together as a community, and you got cut anyway. So you're almost back to the square one you were before you even had your referendum. How about that for a nice slap in the face? So that's some of the things that are done. And again, that same line, I've heard it, well, when the revenue numbers come in, if we've got some money, you're going to get some. We don't know how much. But again, so you're saying that to the colleges, now you're saying it to our public schools. That coupled with the revenue freeze will mean real noticeable changes at some schools. Palmyra Eagle, boy, they're just hanging from a thread. They want to do some improvements. They're getting chewed up by parents. I didn't know you could do this, but there's detachment. There's parents that want to go to McWanaco school, so they're saying, we don't just want to go, we want this whole neighborhood to go to that school district. So while this is going on, they got that problem. School districts like that one are in a world of hurt. And so that's, I don't know what the end is going to, how the story ends for someone like that. But that's going on in their world. And the Republicans love this time, and I don't. Well, just go to referendum. Just go to the taxpayers, and they'll, if they want it, they'll give it to you. Well, it's not quite that simple, is it? And referendums have their place, but to keep the lights on, that's not what they're for. The voucher program shouldn't be expanded at the expense of our kids' education. But you know what? Here comes some spending of money. So far, I've been telling you about all these cuts. Somebody's getting money in this budget. The voucher schools, they're getting $17.2 million to their program. Wow. They're being expanded, so they get to have that. So they must be doing a better job than public schools, right? No, there's no evidence of that. Not any. So there must be no bad stories that ever come out about some scams they run. Not true again. In Milwaukee, just look at some of the fly-by-nights, some of the crooked people that run these, come into an empty shop, storefront, say it's a school, but beyond playing Duck, Duck, Goose, nothing's going on in there. And but there's a Cadillac parked outside, somebody's getting some money. And it's just a horror story after horror story. But I'll tell you what, the Republicans will go to bat for these voucher schools time and time again. To give you one example of this. I had an amendment as they were rushing through a lot of these expansions of voucher schools and giving them money and all this. I said, well, if they're gonna do the same thing, I guess let's start at some of the things we should be able to agree on, that they have to do, that the public schools already have to do. Background checks. Background checks in schools, if the teachers get background checks, of course. The janitor, anybody who works there, part-time help, volunteers, and I'm glad for that. By law, they have to do that. So I said, well, let's have the voucher schools do that same thing. Oh no. We've taken this vote over and over again. Every one of them, the Republicans now, vote that that shouldn't be brought before us and that should not happen. And I've talked to some of them on the side. I said, what are you getting this from? Well, the insurance companies that they have for their schools, they already demand that. So we don't need to do that on top of that. And by the way, these are businesses. If they're going to be a good business, they're going to do the right thing anyway. Wow. And they all lived happily ever after. If only that were true. And if an insurance company wants it, then maybe we should too. And if they want it, why don't we just put it in there? But they won't. And I'll tell you why. 3 reasons. Former Speaker Gard, former Speaker Fitzgerald, and former Speaker Jorgensen, the top lobbyists for the voucher schools, walk the halls to make sure that votes like this are not taken. That's why they don't do it. I have to believe. So there's that. Changes to teacher licensure, we talked about that, would allow folks with bachelor's degrees and some experience in a specific field to take a test and then become a teacher. People have said, oh, that'll never happen. I've heard superintendents say, I will never do that. But here's what will happen. Up north, where they're probably debating whether or not to get rid of their agriculture program, or maybe home ec, or whatever it might be. They're going to be the first ones, in my opinion. They're going to say, you know what? Farmer Bob down the road could come in and teach this class. Maybe we wouldn't have to cut it. And so it begins. And they'll save a few bucks doing it. And then other good school districts will look over the fence and say, well, maybe we should too. Talked to one fellow who, they do this in Texas, and he says, I have to believe that for every one story that might be a success down in Texas, there is 10 or more of how this went horribly wrong. I am a representative for UW Whitewater. I've been in those classes of how you obtain this licensure. I am so glad that our teachers in our state have to, because it is not black and white. Someone who knows a thing or two about farming does not know necessarily a thing or two about keeping a class together. They just don't. You know, some people can probably pull it off, but I want to know they can. Call me old-fashioned. I think there's something to be, again, certainty is a real good thing. And it's trying to achieve that as best you can should be something we all strive for. The uncertainty of how this is going to look is just incredibly scary. I know soon after the governor proposed this, some superintendents got a hold of him and he said, well, you don't have to do it. I'm not making you do it. But some will, and again, it's just not a good idea. The lack of respect or knowledge or whatever the governor is hanging up us on education, it just keeps showing up over and over and over again. And by the way, this doesn't belong in a budget. Get it out, run it by itself, then see what happens. No new funding for special education. My wife is a special ed assistant, and boy, oh boy, you know, that is something we have got to do. We do well. I'm speaking now of the Milton School District, but I know of others too that, gosh, it's something we have got to invest in. It's something that's important. It's there. We've got to do a better job for those little guys, those little girls, because they're there and they need our help and they have a good life. It starts, so the best meal they may have, the best the knowledge or love that they get may be coming from that school. And here the governor, well, just showing us by no new funding or even any attention to it in the budget, I think is a misstep, to say the least. Transportation. Our state faces real issues when it comes to infrastructure. Gas prices have dropped and cars are more efficient, so the taxes on gas isn't bringing in as much as it used to. Governor Walker runs from the problem. I thought he was bold, but he's running from it and creates a bigger one, simply proposing the state to borrow another $1.3 billion for road work. My colleague, Representative Chris Taylor, she hit me with a good quaint phrase. you know, the old phrase, slash and burn, she goes, Governor Walker is slash and borrow. And it's true. That's what he's doing. He's slashing and then he's borrowing. Why? Well, just me guessing, but I think people in Iowa like to hear him say, some do anyway, how he hasn't raised any taxes whatsoever. And I think you can say that, really dress it up nice about how you gave money, $5, back to the people of Wisconsin. I gave back money to the state, to my people in my state. I think to obtain those lines in a speech is why we didn't have not done the right thing. People are ready. This is not a fun thing to talk about, talking about taxes, funding our roads. But I think we're in a place, most of us are, a lot of us are, and saying we got to do something. Raise the gas tax, or do something, or let's try some toll booths, or whatever it might be. Those aren't fun to talk about. But what can the public stomach? And it looked like he was going to do that. Secretary Gottlieb, the DOT secretary, did float some ideas out there and then just got crucified. And then nothing was done, and now ring the bill up on the credit card. But now I've heard some Republicans say, I can't do that, that's too much bonding. But unless you're going to find out where you can get some sources of revenue, you're going to be cutting projects to not borrow as much. And we got a big one right outside the door here. And that might be delayed or cut or whatever so that they don't borrow as much when they should be investigating what we can do about creating some extra revenue to come in to pay for some of these roads that we need. By the way, I look forward to the day that we can have a talk about taking care of roads that we already have, making that a priority. Country roads, city roads, I'm not picky. I want the roads that we already have to a governor to say, let's fix those, let's concentrate on that, this budget. I know there's a lot of road projects that we got to get going, but this budget, I want the roads that are already there to get fixed. How about it? Who's with me? I think a lot of people are with me. But I like to dream. Anyway, so there's that. Our kids will suffer by kicking this can down the road. I'm going to speed it up here, Chuck. Natural resources. The budget is devastating for those of us committed to preserving and protecting our natural resources. It freezes the stewardship program in 2028, which is a crock, because he's supposed to be giving a budget from now until 2 years from now. For him to do that, that's Governor Walker, I guess. Guts the state support for the park system. Also, if he's looking for sources of revenue, if Walmart wants to have Governor Dodge, I think they could have a talk. It could be Walmart State Park. Just thought it there. Eliminates education and science positions at the DNR. What does that have to do with the budget? Nothing. Eliminates public oversight via DNR board. Control again. Eliminates the DAT-CAP board. Again, must be saying some things that Governor Walker doesn't like to hear. I mean, these are boards that I'm glad are there. They don't, many of them, if not all, don't require a salary by anybody on them. They're there because they care, and they know a thing or two. And I want them there, and I want them whispered in the ear. These have been around for a long time. They were the DNR board, for instance, was made, I think it was back in 1932 or back then, because the people who were coming to the legislature like me didn't know a lot of it as much, and that's all right. But they were there to advise, to say, well, you don't want to do that. There's some unintended consequences. Here's what they might be. But the governor, please leave. We don't need you anymore. I think that's very, very foolhardy to be doing that. The GAB, they've had the run-ins on that. This is an idea that comes from Mike Hipsch. You know that name? He's the Secretary of DOA. He's moving on now to go PSC now. But this was a bill when he was in the legislature that he wanted to be nonpartisan. He wanted the elections board to be something that just called it down the middle. Well, now that they have full control, that wasn't such a good idea, I guess. So what do you do about it? Fire the referees, right? Yeah, the budget eliminates, there's a good one for you, Wilson. The budget eliminates all 11 positions from the Government Accountability Board. effectively eliminating the oversight organization. Why would you do this if you're playing by the rules? It makes no sense. Who likes Big Bird? He's in trouble again. Anyone watching Downton Abbey? That must be my staff wrote that one, and she likes that show. Do you like to listen to the morning edition in the car on the way to work? Well, then this budget's not for you, because Governor Walker eliminates 100% of state funding for Wisconsin Public Television and Wisconsin Public Radio. The summary of all of this, this $2.2 billion Walker deficit was created at a time when many other states have budget surpluses because there were really bad choices made by Governor Walker and the legislative Republicans during the last two budgets. That's why we're here. Let's all understand that. This isn't anything anybody did other than the Republicans and Governor Walker. They've been in full control. They've gotten everything they've ever wanted. And we are in this mess because of their doings. Their agenda didn't create jobs as they promised. They didn't grow the economy, and they didn't increase wages for most hard-working Wisconsin families. Governor Walker continues these bad choices in his budget, and they'll hurt our economy even more, hurt the people of this state, and they'll hurt our children. The governor's budget decimates our world-class UW system, one of the economic engines of our state, by slashing $300 million from the system, the largest budget cut in history. And some of the Republicans are going, well, it isn't going to be as big anymore. What's it going to get, 10% less or whatever? Give me some numbers. They aren't right now, but it's going to be a cut, and it's still going to be